Picture a city, a shimmering metropolis rising straight out of the water, larger than Paris, larger than London at the exact same moment in history, built entirely on an island in the middle of a massive lake. Colossal stone pyramids plated in gold and painted blood red, clawing up into the sky. Public plazas packed with over 200,000 people, moving through markets stocked with goods from 1,000 miles in every direction. Aqueducts feeding fresh water into the heart of the island, floating gardens stretching out across the lake like green, drifting mosaics. Spanish soldiers who eventually laid eyes on it for the first time, men who had seen the great cities of Europe, would later write that they genuinely wondered whether what they were looking at was real or whether they were dreaming, comparing it in their own accounts to the enchanted cities described in old chivalric romance novels, because nothing in their own experience back home had prepared them. For a city built entirely on water, connected to the mainland by wide causeways, its canals busy with thousands of canoes moving goods and people in every direction, all of it laid out with a level of order and cleanliness that put most European capitals of the era to shame. A literal Venice, centuries before Europe ever thought to compare anything to Venice. This was Tenochtitlan in the year 1519, the beating heart of the mighty Aztec Empire. And then came the myth. Crack open almost any standard history textbook, and you'll find a tidy, almost miraculous story waiting for you. 500 Spanish soldiers, led by a visionary, brilliant explorer, marching in, terrifying millions of indigenous people with a handful of horses and a few loud cannons, and simply, easily, taking the city. We were taught, generation after generation, that a superior European civilization inevitably rolled over a primitive one, the way a landslide rolls over a village that never stood a chance. But what if I told you that almost everything you learned about the fall of the Aztecs is missing the single most horrifying and single most important piece of the entire puzzle? The conquest of Mexico was never a story of heroic explorers triumphing over primitive natives. It was a chaotic, blood-soaked catastrophe, driven by illegal ambition, a devastating, invisible killer nobody could see coming. And the Aztec Empire's own deeply fractured world turned into a weapon and pointed directly back at its own throat. Hernán Cortés wasn't some tactical genius commanding an unstoppable army. He was a rogue, a master manipulator, a man so desperate for power that he deliberately destroyed his own ships, just to make sure his men had no choice left but to fight or to die trying. Today, we're stripping away the whitewashed legend, layer by layer, to get to the bloody, uncensored truth underneath it. The real story of how a glittering, extraordinary empire was brought to its knees. Not by heroes, but by betrayers on every single side of this story. Welcome to Chronosphere Academy. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button, because to understand exactly how this fire got lit, Cortés first needed a voice that could speak directly into the heart of his enemy. And he found that voice in the single most unlikely place imaginable. You won't want to miss where this story goes next. To understand the sheer, reckless audacity of everything that happened next, you first have to understand exactly who Hernán Cortés actually was. He wasn't acting under orders from the King of Spain. He wasn't some celebrated admiral, sailing under a royal banner with the full weight of an empire behind him. His entire expedition, every single ship, every single soldier, was illegal. In 1518, Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, formally canceled Cortés's planned expedition to the mainland. He'd grown suspicious that Cortés was becoming dangerously ambitious, dangerously powerful. Exactly the kind of man you don't hand an army to and then simply hope for the best. Cortés ignored him completely. He was rogue in the most literal sense of the word. He commandeered the ships. He gathered together roughly 500 desperate men. Not trained soldiers, not disciplined veterans, but miners, farmers, debtors, and fortune hunters chasing rumors of gold. And he sailed for the coast of Mexico anyway. Governor's orders be damned. In the eyes of his own government, he was, for all practical purposes, a criminal in open mutiny. If he came back empty-handed, he'd be facing charges of treason and the kind of punishment Spain reserved for men who stole ships and defied royal authority. He had exactly two options left in front of him: succeed or die trying. And when his own men, terrified by the rumors reaching them about the sheer, overwhelming scale of the Aztec civilization somewhere ahead of them, began demanding to turn back for Cuba. Cortés made one of the most ruthless, calculated decisions in recorded history. He didn't burn his ships, the way the legend likes to tell it. He scuttled them. He stripped every ship of anything remotely useful first. The rigging, the nails, the cannons, hauled off and repurposed for the coming campaign. And then, quietly, deliberately, he had holes bored straight through the hulls and let the ocean swallow them whole. He locked all 500 of his own men on that continent, alongside him, with absolutely no way home. He said to them, in effect, without needing to spell it out any further, there is exactly one way out of here now, and that way runs directly through the capital of Moctezuma's empire. Cortés's single greatest weapon, in the end, was never his cannons. It was never his armor, or his horses, or any piece of European technology at all. It was his own desperate, single-minded, almost suicidal ambition, an ambition sharp enough to burn through every single man who followed him along with it. Worth remembering, too, that Cortés hadn't arrived in the New World as some seasoned military commander with decades of battlefield experience behind him. He'd trained briefly for law back in Spain before abandoning it, then spent over a decade in the Caribbean working as a minor colonial administrator and small-scale landowner, a man of modest, unremarkable ambitions right up until the moment Velázquez handed him command of an expedition and then almost immediately regretted it. He was, by nearly every account from people who actually knew him, magnetic, calculating, and almost pathologically unwilling to accept a ceiling on what he believed he deserved. That personality, more than any specific military talent, is arguably the single ingredient without which none of the rest of this story happens at all. But to actually light this fire, to turn one small, desperate band of mutineers into something capable of toppling an empire of millions, Cortés needed something far more valuable than steel or gunpowder. He needed a voice, someone who could actually speak directly into the heart of his enemy and understand exactly what was whispered back. He found that voice shortly after landing, when a group of enslaved women were handed over to his expedition as a tribute from a local ruler. Among them was a teenage girl named Malintzin, later known to the Spanish as Doña Marina, and to history, more famously, as La Malinche remains, to this day, one of the single most controversial figures in the entire history of the Americas. To some, she is remembered as the mother of the modern Mexican people, the very origin point of an entirely new, blended civilization. To others, she is remembered as the ultimate traitor, the woman whose intelligence and language handed her own people over to a foreign conqueror. Whatever judgment history eventually settles on her, one fact remains undeniable. She was extraordinarily, remarkably brilliant. She spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire itself, fluently as her native tongue. She also spoke Mayan, learned during years spent enslaved among Mayan-speaking peoples along the coast, and within a matter of months of encountering the Spanish, she had begun rapidly picking up Spanish as well. She became Cortés's translator, his chief strategist, whispering in his ear about which local rulers hated which other local rulers, and eventually, the mother of his first son, through La Malinche, piece by piece, conversation by conversation, Cortés began to understand the single fatal flaw sitting at the very heart of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs didn't rule their vast territory through loyalty. They ruled through sheer, absolute terror. Neighboring tribes and city-states were forced to pay crushing tribute, year after year, in goods, in labor, and, most horrifyingly of all, in captives destined for the sacrificial altars atop Tenochtitlan's Great Pyramids. The Aztecs believed, with total religious conviction, that the sun itself would eventually die, plunging the entire world into permanent darkness, unless it was continuously fed a diet of human hearts. And so their armies constantly raided surrounding nations, dragging back thousands of captives every single year to keep that cosmic debt paid. The dozens of tribes and city-states surrounding Tenochtitlan didn't respect Emperor Moctezuma or the empire he presided over. They feared him. And underneath that fear, in many cases, they hated him with an intensity that had been quietly building for generations. with La Malinche translating every word, every promise, every carefully calculated appeal. Cortés didn't simply fight his way toward the capital through raw military force. He campaigned. He walked directly into the cities of the Tlaxcalans, fierce, bitter, blood-soaked rivals of the Aztecs who had spent decades resisting Aztec domination at enormous cost. And he offered them a deal that must have sounded almost too good to refuse. "Help me destroy Moctezuma, and you will finally be free." By the time Cortés actually marched toward the gates of Tenochtitlan, he wasn't leading a small band of 500 Spanish adventurers at all. He was leading a massive indigenous army, tens of thousands strong, made up of furious, vengeful warriors who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity for generations, long before any Spaniard ever set foot on their shores. What happened next stands as one of history's most brutal masterclasses in psychological warfare, betrayal, and, ultimately, a catastrophe that neither side could have possibly predicted or controlled. Moctezuma, genuinely uncertain whether Cortés represented a returning deity foretold in Aztec prophecy or simply a dangerous foreign invader, made the fatal decision to allow the Spanish to enter Tenochtitlan peacefully as honored guests. It was a miscalculation that would ultimately cost him everything. Once safely inside the city's lavish royal palaces, Cortés executed a shockingly brazen political coup. He took Emperor Moctezuma hostage inside his own palace, in the very heart of his own capital. For months afterward, Cortés effectively ruled the Aztec Empire through Moctezuma as a puppet, forcing the humiliated emperor to issue orders on his behalf, while systematically, frantically draining the city of every ounce of gold and treasure his men could get their hands on. But that tension, stretched thinner and thinner across those months, finally, catastrophically snapped. During one of the Aztecs' most sacred religious festivals, while Cortés himself was temporarily away from the city, dealing with a rival Spanish force sent to arrest him, his second-in-command panicked, convinced an uprising was imminent, and ordered his soldiers to massacre thousands of unarmed Aztec nobles and priests who had gathered for the ceremony. The city exploded into open, furious rebellion. The Aztecs rose up in overwhelming numbers, and somewhere in the resulting chaos, Moctezuma himself was killed. Whether by an enraged crowd of his own people, who now saw him as nothing but a Spanish collaborator, or by the Spanish themselves in the confusion, remains genuinely disputed by historians to this day. The Spanish and their indigenous allies were forced to flee for their lives in the dead of night, weighed down by staggering quantities of stolen gold that many refused to abandon even as it dragged them under. Hundreds of Spaniards, and thousands of their native allies, were slaughtered along the narrow causeways connecting the island city to the mainland, cut down or dragged into the lake to drown under the sheer weight of the treasure they'd insisted on carrying with them. This single, catastrophic night became known in Spanish accounts as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Cortés was decisively, humiliatingly defeated. According to legend, he sat weeping beneath a tree just outside the city, watching what remained of his expedition scattered and broken around him. For one brief, genuine moment in this entire story, the Aztec Empire had actually won. But as the shattered remains of the Spanish force retreated into the countryside, they left something behind them, entirely without meaning to. Something that would go on to finish this entire conquest far more efficiently and far more horrifically than any Spanish soldier ever could. Smallpox. The native populations of the Americas possessed absolutely no biological immunity whatsoever to European diseases. Diseases that had been slowly, brutally selecting for resistance among European populations across many centuries of prior exposure. This particular virus tore through Tenochtitlan like a wildfire racing through dry grass. It didn't discriminate between soldiers and civilians. It killed military leaders, farmers, priests, children, entire families wiped out within the same terrible week. Bodies piled up faster in the streets than anyone remaining had the strength left to bury them. And in the wreckage left behind, starvation set in as well, because there was no longer a functioning population left healthy enough to plant, harvest, or distribute food across the city. Modern historians estimate that somewhere close to 40% of the city's entire population died within a matter of months, a mortality rate almost impossible to comprehend on any modern scale of catastrophe, when Cortés finally returned roughly a year later. backed this time by a massive fleet of custom-built warships constructed specifically for fighting across the lake, and an army swollen to well over 100,000 indigenous allies eager for their own long-awaited reckoning against Aztec rule. He wasn't marching against a powerful, thriving empire anymore. He was marching into a graveyard. After a brutal, exhausting 93-day siege, systematically cutting off the city's supply of fresh water and food, strangling Tenochtitlan slowly rather than overwhelming it in one decisive stroke, the city finally fell on August 13th, 1521, the glittering jewel of the Americas. A city that had once rivaled anything standing in Europe was burned to the ground in the aftermath. Its magnificent pyramids systematically dismantled, stone by stone, their materials repurposed to build Catholic churches directly on top of the very ground where Aztec temples had once stood. What happened inside Tenochtitlan during those catastrophic months wasn't an isolated tragedy, contained neatly within the walls of a single city. It was, in horrifying reality, only the visible tip of a demographic collapse that would go on to reshape the entire Western Hemisphere over the following century. Smallpox didn't simply strike Tenochtitlan and then burn itself out. It moved outward from that initial outbreak along the same trade routes, tribute networks, and travel corridors that had once connected the Aztec Empire to its neighbors, reaching populations who had never seen a single Spanish soldier and had no idea a foreign invasion was even underway. Entire communities collapsed before Spanish expeditions ever physically arrived to conquer them, their populations decimated by a disease that had, in effect, marched ahead of the actual army. Modern historians and epidemiologists, working from a combination of Spanish records, indigenous accounts, and archaeological evidence, now estimate that the combined effect of smallpox and subsequent waves of other European diseases, measles, typhus, influenza, among others, killed somewhere between 80 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas within roughly a century of first contact. Some regional estimates run even higher. It stands as, by a significant margin, the single deadliest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history, dwarfing, by raw numbers, nearly every war, plague, or famine in the historical record combined. This detail matters enormously for understanding exactly how the rest of the Spanish conquest of the Americas unfolded, not just in Mexico, but across Central and South America in the decades that followed. When later conquistadors like Francisco Pizarro arrived in the Andes to confront the Inca Empire barely a decade after Tenochtitlan's fall, they weren't simply lucky or simply better armed. They were, in many documented cases, walking into societies already reeling from disease outbreaks that had raced ahead of any European soldier's boots, having traveled through indigenous trade networks stretching thousands of miles beyond the reach of Spanish ships. It's a detail that fundamentally undermines the entire old mythology of European conquest as a triumph of superior culture, superior weaponry, or superior civilization. In city after city, empire after empire, across two entire continents, European conquerors arrived to find populations already catastrophically weakened by an invisible killer that had nothing whatsoever to do with steel, gunpowder, or strategic genius. The sword, in an enormous number of these cases, simply finished what the virus had already started. Moctezuma wasn't the final ruler of the Aztec Empire, though his death during La Noche Triste is often mistakenly remembered as the moment the empire truly ended. In reality, the Aztecs crowned two more emperors in rapid succession during the chaotic year that followed, as smallpox tore through the royal family itself with the same indifference it showed everyone else. The final emperor, a young man named Cuauhtémoc, took the throne in the smoking wreckage of a capital already devastated by disease, inheriting a crown that by that point represented resistance more than actual rule. He was the one who commanded the desperate, ultimately doomed defense of Tenochtitlan during the 93-day siege that finally ended the empire for good, coordinating what remained of the city's fighting population against overwhelming odds, block by block, causeway by causeway, as starvation and thirst did nearly as much damage to his own people as the Spanish assault itself. When the city finally fell, Cuauhtémoc attempted to escape across the lake by canoe, hoping to regroup and continue the resistance from elsewhere. He was captured within hours, brought before Corte, He reportedly asked to be killed on the spot with the dagger at Cortez's belt, refusing to survive the humiliation of his empire's total collapse. Cortez refused him that mercy. Instead, desperate to locate the vast quantities of gold he believed the Aztecs had hidden before the city fell, Cortez had Cuauhtémoc and another surviving noble tortured, their feet held over open flames in an attempt to extract information about treasure that, by most historical accounts, simply no longer existed in the quantities the Spanish were hoping for. Cuauhtémoc survived the torture, permanently crippled, only to be kept as a hostage for years afterward, paraded alongside Cortez's expeditions as a symbol of Spanish dominance over the conquered empire. He was eventually executed in 1525, hanged from a tree in the jungles of what is now Honduras, on suspicion of plotting a rebellion that historians still debate the actual existence of. He was, by most accounts, in his mid-20s when he died, the very last emperor of a civilization that, just 6 years earlier, had commanded a capital larger than nearly any city in Europe. His story rarely makes it into the version of this conquest most people learn in school, and it's worth understanding why that omission matters. The traditional narrative wants a clean ending, a heroic explorer, a primitive empire, a decisive victory. Cuauhtémoc's fate refuses that cleanliness. It leaves you instead with the image of a young man, tortured for information he didn't have, executed on a pretext that may not have even been true, for the crime of having inherited a throne that disease and betrayal had already hollowed out long before he ever sat on it. Before we close this story out, it's worth returning to La Malinche one more time, because her role in this entire catastrophe deserves more than a passing mention in the middle of somebody else's conquest. She was likely somewhere in her mid to late teens when she was handed over to Cortez's expedition as a tribute, alongside a group of other enslaved women, following a battle between the Spanish and a local Maya-speaking population. She had, by that point, already been sold or traded away from her own people once before, under circumstances still debated by historians, and had spent years living as an enslaved person among strangers before the Spanish ever entered the picture at all. It's worth sitting, honestly, with just how limited her actual choices were at every single stage of this story. She wasn't a willing political operative who calmly chose sides in some grand ideological conflict. She was a teenage girl, already stripped of her freedom once, handed from one powerful group of men to another, who happened to possess an extraordinary gift for language, and who used that gift, as best she could, to survive inside a situation that offered her essentially no meaningful alternatives at all. Later Mexican tradition would coin the term Malinchismo, using her name as a byword for betraying one's own people in favor of foreign interests. For centuries, she carried the weight of an entire empire's collapse on her individual reputation, in a way that conveniently let everyone else involved in this catastrophe, Spanish and indigenous alike, off the hook a little more easily. More recent historical scholarship has pushed back hard against that flattened, simplistic narrative. She wasn't simply a translator passively repeating Cortez's words back and forth. She was, by multiple contemporary accounts, an active, skilled negotiator in her own right, someone who understood the deep political fractures running through Mesoamerica far better than any Spaniard ever could, and who leveraged that understanding into a position of genuine influence in a world that otherwise offered enslaved indigenous women essentially none at all. Whether you view her as a survivor making the only rational choices available to her, or as a willing collaborator in her own people's destruction, or, more honestly, as someone whose full, complicated humanity simply doesn't fit neatly into either box. Her story is a reminder that this entire conquest wasn't simply a clash between two clearly defined sides. It was a tangled, deeply human catastrophe, built out of thousands of individual decisions made by people who were, each in their own way, simply trying to survive a situation none of them had ever fully chosen for themselves. It's worth noting, too, that La Malinche's own son with Cortés, a boy named Martin, grew up straddling both worlds in a way that would come to define much of Mexican identity in the centuries that followed. Neither fully Spanish nor fully indigenous, born out of conquest and survival in equal measure, sent to Spain as a child to be raised in his father's world while his mother remained behind in the one she'd helped reshape forever. In many ways, that single family, more than any battle or treaty, foreshadowed exactly what this collision of civilizations was ultimately going to produce. Step back now and look at the full shape of what actually toppled the Aztec Empire, and you'll notice something the traditional heroic narrative has always been remarkably careful to leave out entirely. 500 Spanish soldiers, on their own, never stood a realistic chance against an empire capable of fielding armies in the tens of thousands, defended by a fortress city built on water, accessible only by a handful of narrow, easily defended causeways. The math simply never worked in Cortés's favor. Not through European technology alone, not through horses or steel swords or gunpowder, all of which mattered, but none of which came anywhere close to explaining a conquest of this scale on their own. What actually tipped the balance was an indigenous civil war, generations in the making, that Cortés simply arrived just in time to exploit. The Tlaxcalans and dozens of other tribes didn't fight alongside the Spanish because they'd been dazzled by European superiority. They fought because they had their own long, bloody list of grievances against Aztec domination, and Cortés offered them what looked, in that moment, like a viable path toward finally settling those scores. And even that alliance, decisive as it was, still wasn't ultimately enough to topple an empire the size and sophistication of the Aztecs on its own. It took a microscopic, invisible killer, one that had nothing whatsoever to do with military strategy or diplomatic cunning, tearing through a population with zero prior immunity, to finish what months of warfare and political maneuvering alone hadn't managed to accomplish. The story we've traditionally been handed, the one about a small band of heroic explorers overwhelming a primitive civilization through sheer European superiority, isn't just incomplete. It's almost a kind of historical sleight of hand, one that conveniently erases the tens of thousands of indigenous warriors who did most of the actual fighting, conveniently erases the disease that did most of the actual killing, and conveniently leaves the credit sitting entirely with a small handful of Spanish conquistadors who arrived, more than anything else, with extraordinarily good, extraordinarily horrifying timing. That erasure wasn't accidental, either. The earliest written accounts of the conquest came almost entirely from Spanish sources. Cortés's own letters back to the crown, chief among them, carefully composed to maximize his own credit and minimize the contributions of the tens of thousands of indigenous allies who'd made his victory possible in the first place. It took centuries, and a considerable amount of work by later historians willing to cross-reference indigenous pictorial records, Nahuatl language accounts, and archaeological evidence, to begin reconstructing a fuller picture of exactly how much of this conquest was actually fought, won, and paid for by people whose names never made it into Cortés's own self-congratulating letters home. Hernán Cortés didn't conquer an empire through European superiority, whatever the old textbooks might have told you. He conquered it through illegal, desperate ambition, through the brilliant, complicated negotiations of an enslaved teenage translator who had no easy path forward in a world controlled entirely by men, through a massive indigenous civil war that had been simmering for generations before he ever arrived on that coast, and through the apocalyptic, entirely unintentional devastation of a disease that no one on either side of this story even understood well enough to see coming. The real story of the Spanish conquest of Mexico is a chilling reminder that history rarely unfolds as a tidy fairy tale of heroes and villains, no matter how badly our textbooks might want it to. It's a complicated, blood-soaked ledger, written, as it almost always is, by whoever happens to be left standing at the very end. If you want to keep looking past the polished, whitewashed versions of history to uncover the darker, more complicated truths behind the empires that shaped our world, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because that's exactly what we do here, week after week. What historical hero should we investigate next? Let me know down in the comments below, and tell me honestly, did any part of this story surprise you as much as it surprised us putting it together? Until next time, keep questioning the narrative. Welcome to Chronosphere Academy. That's the story history rarely tells you the whole way through. Not because the full version is any less dramatic than the myth. If anything, it's considerably more so. But because the full version refuses to let anyone involved walk away looking simple or clean or entirely innocent.